Hello everybody, welcome back to another tutorial. This is a video that I've wanted to make for a very long time because I've always been a little bit underwhelmed by some of the other bassline tutorials that have been out there for Psytrance music. So in this video I'm going to explain everything I know about making a Psytrance bassline, and we're going to look at 5 examples together. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. This is going to be a full guide to the Psytrance bassline. So this video took me a long time to research and to write all the ideas that I wanted to mention in this video. So for that reason, I'm going to ask you to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also leave a comment with what you think about this video. I would gladly appreciate some feedback on this. The final thing I want to mention is that I am going to take a little break next week. Next week, my sister and her boyfriend are coming over to stay here in Italy. She lives outside of Italy. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time with them, and therefore I'm probably do not have the time to make a video next week. So at least for next week, maybe even for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to take a little break. So this will be the last video for 1 week or 2 weeks, depending on how much time I have after that. Hey guys, I just wanted to quickly say, if you want to support this channel, go to my Spotify or Apple Music. There you can follow me and add some of my songs to your daily listening playlist. Thank you very much. Let's get back into the video. So I'll talk a little bit about how this video is structured. It's going to be 4 parts. First, I'm going to give some very basic theory. I'm going to talk about the function of the bassline. I'm going to talk about some terms that we use. I'm going to talk about some of the basic concepts surrounding bass creation. After that, we're going to fire up the DAW, and then we're going to actually look at some theory like inside the DAW, inside Serum, which is going to be our instrument of choice here. But this is going to apply to different synths as well. You can use a different synth if you want to. I like to use Serum because there's a lot of people that have it, and the visualizations in Serum are very good to see what's going on. Other than that, I might be in some cases use a different tool to visualize that. If I ever use a tool, I will mention it and I'll leave a link in the description. After that, we're going to be creating 5 basslines together, and I'll go over some of the basic ideas when I'm actually creating a bassline. I'm also going to give you this exercise of making basslines yourself, so I recommend you stick watching for that. Basically, I'm going to ask you to make the same 5 types of basslines that I'm going to cover, and then share them with the community in Discord so that you can discuss them, see where different people differ in the way they create basslines and stuff like that. In that case, the idea is that you compare it with other people in the community and exchange ideas and exchange ways that you have created your bassline. So there's an extra level to this video. If you want to join in on that, join my Discord server in the description, and then you can go to the channel exercises and you can participate in that. Then after we've made those 5 basslines, I have some final ideas that I want to talk about. So now that that's all out of the way, let's get into the theory. So to talk about the function of the bassline, which I consider the second most important element in any Psytrance track, we first need to look at the first most important element, which is the kick. So the kick is kind of the anchor of your track. It's giving on the beat, and it allows people to really dance to your music. It is therefore usually very punchy and has a nice little bit of impact kind of feeling to it, so that it really kind of drives you to dance. And then the bassline, what it's doing is it's kind of supporting the kick. So it's not overpowering the kick, it's not being more dynamic, but it adds a little bit of a groove and then a little bit of extra low end as well in the parts that the kick does not have any low end. Usually the bassline also provides some lower mid-range on which you can mix your lead elements, which tend to be in the higher mid-range, and then you'll have your hi-hat in the high range of the frequency spectrum. So it covers both the sub as well as some of the lower mids mainly. But usually basslines have frequencies contents that go way up even in the high frequencies to range, kind of the 10K to 15K mark. And that's because the bassline tends to be, in most classical Psytrance ideas, it tends to be very plucky, and it has kind of a high-end transient and a higher mid-range transient, and that allows it to add that groove that I was talking about before, in combination with the kick, which obviously also has that kind of high-end impact sound. So I'm trying to get the boring stuff out of the way first, so I'll go over the terms that we use. The first term that I want to discuss is signal. When we say a signal, what we mean is it's a digital representation of sound inside, for example, DAW or in any other musical program. So I'm bringing out the whiteboard again because I know you guys like the whiteboard. It's a good way to explain these kind of things. So let's actually start with explaining what the signal actually is. So imagine if I have a sound which is kind of an oscillation in time, right? Which the speaker produces. You can imagine that you kind of want a signal which says to the speaker at what position it needs to be in time. So for example, let's say that we have position here and time here. So this would be T and this would be P. We can say that at idle, because the speaker can either go forward and backward, say this is 0, and then at 1 the speaker is all the way forward, and then here at -1 the speaker is all the way backwards. I hope you can see that if I put it there. You should see it. So we have 0, 1 for all the way forward, and -1 for all the way backward. Now a signal is just going to be something that looks, for example, like this. And this is an analog signal because all of the points are continuous. This is a continuous function. If you know what that means in mathematics, then you know what kind of properties it has. When we talk about usually about basslines and synthesizing basslines, we're usually working with digital signals. So what a digital signal is, it's a collection of numbers which represent values of an analog signal in time. So what you would have is you would have points here which are spaced equally apart, and for each point you'll store the value inside memory, and then you can change those values using effects and whatever, and any kind of processing of the signal. So the next term is a wave cycle. Now for a wave cycle you can imagine kind of a signal which is constrained within a certain amount of time. So for example, here we have an analog signal of a sine wave which looks like this. This is spaced over some amount of time, right? And in this case, what you can do is you can say, okay, for this time, we can get a frequency. So the frequency is, of course, 1 over the time. And musical notes have frequencies. So every musical note that you play has a different frequency. And what that means is if we know this frequency, we can take a time constraint in such a way that if we play this and we loop it, that the signal will play at the note that we want the frequency of. So a wave cycle is a signal which has a specific length so that when looped, it plays a certain note. So next I want to talk about our harmonic. And a harmonic, what it is a single sine wave within usually a collection of multiple sine waves. And that single sine wave sits at a certain frequency and has a certain volume and also has a certain phase, which we'll get into later what that is. And what you can have is you can have a collection of these harmonics, and usually the harmonics in any tonal sound, we can also have atonal sounds where this property is not true, but in a tonal sound what you have is that a harmonic is always a multiple of what we call the fundamental harmonic. So let's say we have the fundamental harmonic here at 100 Hertz. And then we'll have a second harmonic here, which is at 200 Hertz. And then we have a third harmonic here, which is at 300 Hertz. So you can see that it's multiples here. And the fundamental is called the fundamental because it is the lowest harmonic in the series. So this is what you multiply by 2, 3, 4, 5 to get the next harmonic in the next series. So in this case, this is second harmonic, third harmonic, and so on and so on. So this collection of harmonics that we talked about here is called a harmonic series. Now, the harmonic series is kind of responsible for the tone of the sound, and you can usually edit them in the sound making process. So it's really important that we know what the harmonic series is, so we can really use it and dial in the right tone for our bass line. The final thing to note about harmonics is that usually the lowest harmonic in the bass sound is called the sub. This is because it plays between 30, 50, maybe a little bit higher in terms of frequency, in terms of hertz. And that's called the sub region. So therefore the lowest harmonic is called the sub because it sits in that region of frequencies. So next up is phase. So if we go into our example from before of a wave cycle, where we have a waveform, and this cycle is such that it starts like this. This would be the starting point of our wave cycle. So if we start playing this in a synthesizer, the wave will usually start from here, unless we set a certain phase. So we can set a phase in degrees, and the degrees determine how far within here the wave starts. So the degrees would be 0 here and 360 for one full rotation. This is a 6. From there you can set any value in between, and that will obviously set a starting point in between there. So for example, 90 degrees would be right here, 180 degrees would be right here, and 270 degrees would be right there. Now I mentioned before that harmonics also can have phases. Because harmonics are essentially sine waves within a series, we can set an individual phase for each of those sine waves and therefore kind of slightly change the tone and also the dynamic characteristics and just the look of the waveform of the signal that we're creating. This is going to be very important because the phase is one of the most important elements of the bassline, the whole phase relationship with the kick as well with the harmonics between themselves. That's all very important when creating your bass sounds. So the next term that we need to keep in mind is phase offset. And the phase offset looks at two signals, either two harmonics or two full signals, and determines the difference in phase between them. So if I have another signal that goes like this, you can see this is the same kind of signal, but it's offset. In this case, it is set 90 degrees backwards. So this point here is 90 degrees backwards in terms of phase. So the phase offset is 90 degrees in this case. Next up is a little bit more difficult to explain. I'll go over some examples of this effect later, but the effect that I'm talking about is phase shift. This is where a certain process can create a difference in the phases of each harmonics within your sound, or with all of the harmonics, therefore the phase of the full signal. The next term is phase alignment. Here we can see again, we have two sounds which have a phase offset. If they did not have a phase offset, we would say that they're phase aligned. So if the offset is 0, i.e. they're starting at the same point, they're phase aligned. Finally, in terms of phase, I want to talk about cleanliness. Cleanliness is kind of a measurement of how much or how little phase shift there is. We usually say that the bassline is clean when it has very little or no phase shift. So now that we've covered that, let's look at 4 basic but important concepts regarding basslines. So the first one is that generally speaking, basslines use saw waves. So that's a particular waveform that has a particular harmonic series, which I will show in a bit, which is used because we discussed before how the bass provides both the sub but also the lower mid-range, most of the energy there. So to get that lower mid-range full and to get it sounding nice, usually saw waves are preferred. There are some exceptions. Some people tend to use square waves as well, which is the other harmonic series, or more complex harmonic series sometimes as well. But generally speaking, I think 98% of the tracks that I have in my catalog use saw waves as a bassline. So that's a good starting point if you're new into making basslines, just to start there so you can get close to basslines that you maybe like, because most of them use a saw wave. The second concept is because the bassline creates a stable rhythm together with the kick, it is usually very plucky in the sense that it has a little bit of a transient, usually a little bit fuller in terms of the frequency range. Again, I talked about it before, how the transient usually has frequencies all the way into the high end to keep it rhythmical and to make it recognizable within that rhythm that you've created with your bassline. The next important concept is that you can use volume envelopes to set the dynamics in your bassline. So usually from the synthesis part, what you want to do is have the dynamics already controlled within the patch, so you have to do at the least amount of post-processing possible. I'll get into why you don't want to do a lot of post-processing later when we talk about some of the problems that can occur when you do too much post-processing. Speaking about post-processing, the final concept is that post-processing is used to kind of shape the sound. You shouldn't be making any drastic changes to the way the sound sounds once you're out of the synth. And most of the sound should be coming from the synth already, and minimal post-processing should be used to kind of shape it further into the mix and to just give it kind of the final tone that you want it to have. So now let's get into the DAW and look at some of the theory I've set up there. So let's start off by looking at a very basic bassline setup here. So here in the DAW we have a kick, which is just a sample for now. And then we have our bassline here, which without any post-processing and just being a simple patch, sounds like this together with the kick. So this is very basic, just to get over the basics to show you what is going on. So let's look at this patch, and obviously later in the video we're going to actually make some things from scratch. And there's a few things that you want to notice here. One is the waveform that we're using. Let's actually look at its harmonic series. You can see that every bin is used here. Now that's a very important distinction, that you have this curve and this bin that way, set up this way, because this is the saw wave harmonic series. And as we discussed before, usually saw waves are used. Now that doesn't mean that you cannot do anything here. You can, for example, modify individual harmonics to get a different sound. So versus something like this. So you can change the tone within the harmonic series. And I'll later go over exactly how this works when we're actually creating a bassline, what kind of considerations you need to make here. But for now, just note that this is our harmonic series of a saw wave. So you're probably wondering how a square wave would look like. How would you recognize that? And a square wave, when we create a square wave here, you can see a different shape coming. You can see every other bin is used here. Every other harmonic here is used. So that's the difference. And you can see that on a spectrum analyzer as well. If I open up a new serum here, I can quickly show you how you can use a spectrum analyzer to actually see if you're dealing with a square wave or a saw wave. So let's open up a spectrum, and we're going to make it a bit bigger. And we're first going to play a saw wave. So we're playing at G0, and our first harmonic here, which you can see shows up neatly here at G1. So you can see there's an octave between them. So you can see 48 Hertz and here double 96 Hertz. So that's how you recognize a saw wave. But going in here and turning this into a saw wave, we see that that first harmonic right here is not used. This, or the second harmonic actually, I should say. This is the first harmonic, the fundamental. So that on the spectrum analyzer, you can see this dip where there used to be a dip, there isn't anything anymore, and it's just this peak, which is at a different key. So this is G and this is a D. You can see down below here, it says the key, and it's no longer an exact multiple. It's actually this frequency times 3, because if you remember from what we said about harmonics before, it's still a multiple of this fundamental here. But in this case, it's times 3 instead of times 2. So going back into our patch, we have some other things set up as well. One important thing is that the phase of this waveform is always the same. You can set up a random amount of phase here. And that means that within the synth, it can trigger from any starting point here. So you can randomize where you want it to start. Usually for creating bass sounds, we set this at 0. Otherwise, we run into phase issues, because it can happen that, for example, if you have a random phase, in some cases you might phase align the kick and the bass, where in other cases that is not the case. Or if you're working with multiple layers, this becomes an even bigger problem. So for now, just know that you would usually want to set the randomness to 0 and then choose a phase point here. Now this point has a profound impact on the tone of your bass sound. So let's actually play it and hear what it does. You can hear that the clickiness and the transient of the bass sound is really changing when I move around this phase knob. So you can see where it's actually drawing the phase line, the starting point. That's the yellow line there. And you can see what's happening when we get close to this point here. It is just starting off by the click. And because the bass line is nothing with that more than a saw wave with a filter envelope in essence, you have that the filter cutoff at the very start of the sound when this click is playing is all the way up. So you get a lot of that high energy from this initial click coming through, because this is like an impulse file. So it will produce all of the frequencies at once because of the fact that it's such a steep click, and therefore we really get that high-end click coming through. Now if we put it up later, it's going to happen later in the modulation. So imagine that this cycle starts playing from, for example, here, and then this envelope, this is an LFO, but it's used as an envelope, is also going to start playing. Maybe it plays until here before that click happens, and then in that case the filter cutoff is already going down in the modulation. So I mentioned this modulation here. This is the envelope for the filter. We've set up a filter here at 18 dB per octave. That is not a rule. I would say 12 dB per octave also works. It sounds a little bit more open than the 18 one. And then finally you have the 24, which sounds a little bit more plucky, more aggressive than the 18 one. I wouldn't recommend using the 6 dB per octave filter because that just sounds too open to me. I don't think you can get any good results with that, to be honest. So in this case I went for the 18 dB, which is a nice in the middle, and it's controlled with this envelope here. So you can see how this envelope works. Is that it's all the way up at the very beginning of the sound. So this is in 16 note, which is the exact note length here. So the filter is going to be all the way open at the start, and then it's just going to turn down over the duration of the note. And changing this envelope, the way I've set it up here, allows you to really dial in the main tone or the main pluck of your bass line. So let's actually play with it a little bit. So you can really see that it has a very big effect on the way it sounds. Now, in other synths, you might not have the availability of doing it like this, where I use an LFO and I can just draw on the points wherever I want. This is a little bit of a tip I give you, is to use the LFO as an envelope if you're working with Serum or any other synth that can support that. The reason being because you can tie the length to the exact note length of your bass line. In this case, the bass line is made out of 16 notes. We'll talk about MIDI in a little bit. Basically, to ensure that your timing, what you're seeing here, matches the note length here, you don't have to work out any timings of the envelope here, which just works with normal timings. You can instead use this envelope, and it will always be to the exact time of the bass note. So this filter envelope is controlling the filter, but we have another envelope here which is controlling the volume. And you can see this is really where you control the dynamics. If you want it very sustained or very attacky, then you can change that. So I'm actually going to open up a plugin here which allows me to see what is happening. It's called Psyscope here, which is a good tool to have. I'll leave a link in the description. But this allows you to see the bassline that you're working on. So let's keep this down below here while we modify the dynamics of our bassline. So keep an eye out for here what is changing on the waveform. So what I recommend is that you always have a little bit of silence here at the end of your note. That way the end of the note doesn't get in the way of the beginning of the next note. What you can also do is to use your MIDI here and make the notes shorter. That will also have the same effect. If I make them very short, you can actually see that from the synth here. You can see how it stops earlier. But I prefer to make my notes as long as I can, because I do like sustained sub-bass in my bass lines usually. So these are the modulations that we've set up. Finally, I want to talk about this here. What this is doing is it allows us to control the effectiveness of this envelope here, or the amount that the envelope actually modulates the volume of our bass line by the velocity. So we can use velocity information. You like we set up in this MIDI clip, to change the volume of individual bass sounds. So you can see, going back into Psyscope, that the first one is a lot quieter than the second and the third bass note here. And the reason why we do that is because our kick is playing here, and we want to give the kick a little bit of space so that the sub bass can come out and together with the bass line create this bass here. So here there is no sub bass, and therefore these two bass hits can be a little bit louder. So again, this is a very simple bass setup. We're going to go into much more complex setups in a little bit, but first I want to go over some of the effects that you can use to post-process your bass line. So the first one is a saturator, and let's open up Psyscope to see what that does, and I'm going to play it again. And once I start driving it up, you can see that it's going to increase the loudness of the bass, but it's going to do it in a different way than, for example, with the volume control that we looked at before. You can hear that it starts to distort. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of using a saturator on the bass line. The reason being is if you're using a velocity control like I do, it's going to turn up those lower notes a lot more than it's going to turn up the higher notes. That is because it's actually going to clip the signal, so it won't allow it to go into the reds or be louder than 0 dB. And therefore, if you set up a very extreme saturation like this, which I wouldn't recommend, you can see that this wave is not going to get a lot louder, but this one definitely is. Obviously, it is more square because more of the wave is louder, but in terms of sheer volume loudness, this has definitely come closer to this here. But it is still useful to use a saturator because it can add some extra harmonics to it. In this case, what it will do is it will add some harmonics to the sound. So the harmonic series that it's going to add is actually the square wave if you're not using any asymmetrical saturation. If you're using asymmetrical saturation, then I think, which you cannot do here, I believe. No, there is no control for asymmetry in this saturator, so you cannot set up asymmetry here, I think. But if you were to use that, then it would add actually saw wave harmonics instead of square wave harmonics. So the next thing you can do is use an EQ for tone control. So you can actually change the volume of certain frequencies of your bass sound. So you can add like a bit more higher mid-range, some more click. Some more mid-range or some sub even if you want. But you need to be very careful with the EQ here. And if you can get away with not using an EQ, if you can, for example, edit the harmonics instead, then that's definitely a better solution. And that's because EQs tend to introduce a lot of phase shift. So you might have seen what happened to the waveform when I was sweeping down and up this boost that I have here. Let's look at that again, what is actually happening to the waveform. And I want you to see something very particular here, which I'm going to show by also recording it. Look at what's happening here. You can see there's certain frequencies kind of coming in there, right? You can definitely see that the wave is kind of becoming longer and longer there. And to actually show what's happening here, let's look at where that lands. So I'm going to set up resampling here so we can actually see what happens when we do that. Let's set up our boost exactly where the sub bass hits. And now let's actually record. And you can see, disregarding how loud this thing now is, you can see that this sub bass tail here sits on the transient of the kick. So that's a big problem that the EQ is going to introduce. It's going to make your tails longer of the certain frequencies that you're boosting. So I'm boosting this 36 Hertz frequency. You can see this tail is at 36 Hertz. So that's going to be post-ringing. That's what this term is called. And it's going to, when you're boosting, this case obviously being an extreme example, it's going to basically prolong those frequencies that you're boosting. Another thing that you can see, if we put it a little bit higher, maybe like here, is that the clicks are going to change. So the transients are going to change. Again, we don't need that for this. We can use Psyscope. You can see here how the transient, there's like an extra oscillation up there. And that again is that same effect. Because these clicks produce every frequency. If we add this big boost here, it's again going to delay those frequencies here. So this frequency, again, this is just the same post ringing sitting on top of the sound that is already playing. So you can see it's kind of oscillating up and down here as well, and again here. So that's what it's doing. It's just taking that oscillation of this particular frequency that we're boosting and just delaying it by, as you can see, quite a bit here. So more experienced producers might say that linear phase is a solution to that. Linear phases fixes these post-ringing problems, but it does introduce a new problem which I want to show. So to show you the problem with linear phase, I've got an impulse file here. And what an impulse file is it's just a file with a very short amount of like a volume spike. And you can see it is very, very short. And what this allows us to do is it measures post-ringing as well as pre-ringing, which is the problem with linear phase. So here I have an EQ set up like this. It's a very giant, strong boost. I'm going to lower its Q as much as I can to really introduce a very large kind of pre-ringing effect, because the higher, the more extreme the settings, the more extreme the pre-ringing is going to be. And then I'm going to render it out. I'm not going to play it because this will sound annoying, but let's actually flatten it and see what's happening. So if we look at it now, there's something which isn't very noticeable until we like boost the volume by quite a lot, and that's that there's all this extra information here. Now, this is basically post-ringing. Because we've set up an extreme example, we still have post-ringing. But what linear phase is going to do is it's going to take that post-ringing that we had before and it's going to move that frequency forward. So it's going to apply a frequency shift to that as well. And to kind of counter the frequency shift that the EQ itself introduces. So this is done with clever filtering, but what it can do in this case with linear phase, because it's shifted forwards, is that it actually takes that frequency and puts it before the transient. And if you have something like this and it's going to go through a limiter and some other processing and some other compressors, this volume, even though in this case we have turned it up very, very loud, so the effect is very, very minor, it's still there and it's still this kind of like fade into your transient. So it can really mess up a transient if you have too much pre-ringing. If you try to solve everything with the EQ, then you're going to run into problems even when using linear phase. So I talked about dynamics control. Let's actually look at that. I'm going to load up a simple compressor here. And what a compressor allows us to do is, if you don't know what a compressor does, is it allows you to, above a certain volume, kind of reduce the volume in a controlled way. So the way this works for basslines is that usually I would suggest you do all of your volume elements in here. But if you really want to use a compressor, let's actually look at what it does and play with some settings. I'm going to place this up here and then play it. You can see already it's doing something, and we can reduce the ratio. So this is how much the volume is lowered. And you can see that on the waveform. And then this is the threshold. This is the level above which volume starts to be lowered. So a lower threshold, it will be more aggressive sounding, and you can see that in the waveform as well. Then we have the knee size. This allows you to smoothly transition to the set ratio that you have. So if you have a very strong ratio, you can see it kind of curves into it. And if you have a low knee setting, it just suddenly starts going like that. Finally, there's a range control, which allows you to set the maximum amount of volume diminishing that it will do. The final two things that are important are the attack, which determines how quickly the compressor reacts, and this is the release, which determines how quickly the compressor goes back up to the volume that it originally has once the signal goes below the threshold again. So as I said, dynamics control isn't often used, but it is something that sometimes can be handy if you run into problems like that. Again, same here with dynamics. Usually what happens is after a dynamics unit, people turn the volume up again, and you'll have the same problem that we had with the saturator before, where if you're using velocity like I do, it might turn up your bass sound way too much there, and it starts clashing with the kick. Next up is an effect that is often neglected a little bit, and that's stereo control. Now, a good rule of thumb is that your bass should be mono. and therefore you should say that you don't need stereo control. But there are some cases which we're going to look into later where you're layering in extra stereo information into the bassline. With that, you do need to control for some stereo. So I'm going to quite brutally add some stereo width to this bassline here, and I'm going to set up very mild settings here in terms of width. But there's going to be a little bit of width. So you can see here we have mono line, and you can see that it's kind of slightly curving outside of that. So there's a little bit of stereo information. Now what you usually want, as we said, is you want your full bass to be mono. And the reason why that is because generally speaking, you want your sub to be mono. So stereo control allows you to control different frequencies and the stereo image of those certain frequencies here. So for example, if we want our sub bass to be mono, we can just set the sub bass mono. And you can hear now that we have a little bit more central bassline than before. Again, here you also have different filters. So here you can also select linear phase in this particular plugin. Now this linear phase option is again important because when you're working with anything multiband, then you're using filters, which is the same principle as an EQ in that it changes the phase in exactly the same way as the EQ. So in that case, that's why it's also important to be able to set this to linear phase so you can compare the two and see if either linear phase or non-linear phase, just normal phase behavior, if that works best for your particular bassline. Another effect that is often used on your bassline is creative filtering. So here I have set up a rack, which is a creative filter rack, which allows me to high pass or low pass the bassline at any point in the track. So I have laid out 4 bars here so I can actually show you what that sounds like. So I'm going in here, and in this first case, we're just going to apply a high pass filter to our bassline. You often hear that in transitional periods, in build-ups as well, going into fills, that kind of thing. Usually what you'll have in the break is that you're using a low pass, which sounds like this. And here again, I have the ability to choose between linear phase, which is the default option, or non-linear phase, which I can turn on like that. And these setups will still work. So that's how I do it, but you can do it differently. Maybe you have dedicated filter plugins. Again, I do that as well. Maybe you have a filter plugin that allows for both linear phase and non-linear phase. In that case, you can switch within the plugin. So yeah, that's kind of the setup that I have for that kind of thing. But this is just a rack that easily allows me to filter the bassline or the kick as well. If I need to filter the kick, I'll put it on. The final effect that I want to talk about is sidechaining. Now, as I said, I use the velocities to sidechain to set the certain volumes of individual notes, but you can also use a volume LFO like this. So let's set this up and make them all at the same volume. Now, if we sidechain it, let's listen to the result. I'm going to set up a shape that I like, something like this. Now, in this case, we have some issue because of phase misalignment. So something like this should be a nice sidechain. The reason why that happened, by the way, is because of plugin compensation as well as linear phase processing. Linear phase processing takes a little bit of a delay to do. Therefore, anything linear phase will mess with the internal clock of this LFO tool here. There are other plugins that maybe compensate for that a little bit better. There might be other DAWs that compensate for it better. I don't know if this is just an Ableton thing. But for me, this is the reason why I sidechain using the velocity, so I don't have to work with a mess like this, which, as you can see, is just not really comprehensive, and I am having a hard time explaining it in this case. But yeah, you can see sidechain is basically doing the same thing in that the first note is less loud than the other notes. Let's actually pull up Psyscope again to show that. And again, Psyscope as well has some issues with linear phase plugins here. So we have to set that forward as well for for it to be on the grid and showing you what it is actually doing. So now let's talk a little bit about the MIDI here. So we've shown some basic ideas with the MIDI. One is the 16 notes here. You can see we have our kick on the beat here, and therefore there shouldn't be a bass note here. But already our kick is losing some volume here, so we definitely want a bass note here. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can turn this bass note off to get a different feel, to kind of get a little bit of swing. And with it, it sounds like this. So those are very basic 16 notes. What you can do is add some melody to it. So let's take a 1-bar loop here, and I'm just going to and put this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can copy this if you want. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Something like this should be a nice melody for a bass line. So the way this works is I did it in the minor scale because that's the scale that I like. You can see the melody here if you want to copy this particular melody, but you can experiment with different melodies for your bass line to play to make it a little bit more interesting. We'll talk about the offbeat bass next. This is a particular kind of bass sound where instead of 16 notes, we're using 8 notes. What you would need to do in that case is to set your envelope to 8-note envelopes and maybe change some of the envelope shapes accordingly. But in this case, it sounds like this, which is an offbeat sound. The final cousin in this kind of sequence is the triplet bass. So let's enable triplets here and set these to 16-note triplets for this one as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to hit Ctrl 3 here in Ableton and then duplicate it twice like this. And here in this case, you can see instead of having 1 or 3, we have 2 notes here. So in total 3 different like click elements here. And that sounds like this. So the next bassline type that we'll look at, the next MIDI, is the sliding bass. So this is a particularly weird kind of bassline in that it does cover the kick, but because of the sidechaining, it's not going to interfere with the kick. So it also is usually accompanied by different envelopes. So in this case, I'm going to carve out an envelope which looks something like this. I'm just going to quickly make it. I'll get into sliding basses more in detail later. But let's set an envelope up like this as well. And this should give us a sliding bass. Maybe something like this. Again, you can play with it. I'm going to go over sliding bass synthesis later. What is cool about the sliding bass is that you can apply the same concept as before with the notes. So what you'll do is you'll have to set this to mono and legato. And that way it will slide between the pitches at whichever speed you set here. So because this is a MIDI, we can play with it. And for example, set something like this and this, and yeah, let's actually go to 5 here. Something like this is a very basic melody. Of course, you can do whatever you want with it. Maybe you want to go down at the end. You can do that too. Maybe like a whole octave if you really want to. You can do something crazy. So there's a lot you can do here again, and you can experiment with the sound that you have on here as well. Obviously making it more open sounding, like with more higher filter cutoff, will make it easier for the listener to understand what the slide is actually doing. But it might not be the sound that you're looking for. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about some more advanced MIDIs here. So I've set up 16 notes again. What you can do in more advanced basslines, what we'll look in later, is add layers to it. So you would actually have multiple sounds playing at the same time. One cool trick that you can do, if you have a layer, let's say this is our bass layer, that you accentuate certain notes by not playing it on certain notes. So again, I'm going to quickly create a layer here just for the example, and we'll just isolate some frequencies using the simple EQ. I'm not going to worry about phase shift here just for this example. I just want to show you what it sounds like if you have like a layer to it, which just adds some extra stuff to certain notes. Obviously, this is a very crude example, but you can hear how this note and this note is definitely kind of accentuated within the rhythm. So you can use different MIDIs on your layers, which we'll again look into later. So now let's look at the main layers that I recommend you work with. Now, not every bassline is going to require all of these layers. In fact, the more you become fluid in making basslines, the more you'll see that most layers can kind of be replaced with something that you can do in the synth itself. Usually we layer because it makes it easier to divide up the different components of the bassline. So let's start off with the easiest, and that is kind of a gritty extra tone to it. So what I like to do is I like to duplicate it, and if I want to add some grittiness to it, I'll usually distort this layer quite a bit, and then using some filtering, we can actually use this filter here. For that, we can add some grittiness to it, and just let's look at what it sounds like now. Something like this. We can maybe even make it even more distorted. So that is just going to add some grittiness to it and some nice mid-range. The second layer that I recommend you kind of work with and maybe try out on your basslines is a stereo layer. So this allows you to create stereo with using a particular layer, and that allows you to level it in with the mixer here, which I really like in order to really control the amount of stereo that your bassline has. So I'm going to remove the stereo spread and control from the other two layers, as we're going to have a dedicated layer here. So now let's add a very extreme stereo spread to it. Let's actually just use this one and just spread it some more and make it some wider and a few more bands. And I'm actually going to remove this here, and I'm going to set these as they were before. And then finally, using a normal EQ here, I'm going to set up mid-side here, and I'm going to remove all of the mid frequencies here like this. So this should leave us with only the side frequencies. And if we listen to it now, you can see it's very, very stereo. Now we don't want this stereo bassline to clash too much with our main bassline. So we're going to filter out the low frequencies and maybe some of the higher ones as well. So now together with our other layers, it sounds like this. The final layer that you might want to consider adding to a bassline like this is a click layer. So let's add a click layer and click layer. What I'm going to do for this layer is I'm basically going to turn off everything from the stereo layer here, except the side chaining. And what we want is we want really a transient here. And I do want all of the high-end energy from the transient. So I'm actually going to turn off the filter, and we're going to fully concentrate on this LFO 2 here. And we're just going to set a very short click. And because we can set our phase anywhere, let's set our phase very close here. We can, within this little volume spike that's going to play at the start of the sound, capture this one click and just output that, and then the volume would be 0 like at this point here. So that's going to sound and look like this. And you can tweak it however you want, maybe make it a bit longer. Maybe start a bit earlier. Something like this. You can see it's not really showing up on Psyscope, I think, too much. Let's first set this back to where it should be. And then I think I can zoom in on individual clicks and it should show me it better. For some reason, it's not registering the click too much, but we can see it happening on LFO tool here. So I'm wondering why that is. You can see the clicks there. Maybe it's because it should be like this. Yeah, no, I don't know why it's not showing up, but we are definitely like going up here. We're up here when it starts playing. You can see the starting phase there. And then it's going down and then it should close out here. So we can just by ear listen to this click and now we have something like this. Now this is very quickly for the examples. I'm wearing headphones, so I wasn't trying to make a good bass line. This was just to show you what you can do and which 4 elements I would work with. One element that you might see that is missing is a dedicated sub bass. I don't like to use a dedicated sub bass because the bass line or the sub bass in here does everything that I needed to do. And again, this is something that I will show once we get into making some actual bass sounds. So you can see that each layer here performs its own function. And that's really the core idea of layering like this, is that you don't really layer in terms of frequency regions. Some people do that. They'll have a sub, they'll have something for the mid-range, they'll have something for the more high-end mid-range, and then they'll have like a click for the very high-end, for the above 10K kind of thing. And I highly recommend that you don't work like that, because in this way, what this allows you to do is it allows you to kind of overlap with it, and it glues the sound together a lot nicer when you think of functions like this. So the stereo layer does the stereo, the click layer does the transient, the gritty layer does kind of the mid-range tone of it, and then we have the bass line or the main bass line sitting under that and kind of gluing everything else together as well, because this obviously is still playing in all of the frequencies. That final point is not to say that there shouldn't be any separation. Obviously, you should separate up until it starts affecting the sound of it. So if you're taking away frequencies that are really key to the sound, then I would say that you shouldn't do that. But there should be some level of separation. You wouldn't, for example, want your click layer to have a lot of sub bass, or you don't want your stereo layer to have a lot of sub bass, or even your grid layer. Those should all be free of the sub bass, so that the bass line here can come through like very, very cleanly. And again, that's why I discourage using an actual sub bass, because A, it's probably not going to be phase aligned. There's probably going to be phase issues. And B, there's another chance that you might stack 2 sub basses on top of each other, one from the main bass line and one from the dedicated sub that you have, and that's just going to sound weird, and you shouldn't do that. You should probably have your sub bass inside the main layer. So let's now talk about some good practices that you should keep in mind when working on bass lines. The first one is to keep your bass line clean, and with that I mean to keep the phase shift at a minimum. This is an absolute essential if you want your bass sound to sound nice, although there are some specific cases in which this is not true, which we'll get back to later. But generally speaking, what's going to happen if you have post-ringing, especially post-ringing which happens at the spot of the kick, you're really going to mess up the transient of your kick or the transient of the next bass line in the sequence. So for that reason, you want your bass line to sound as clean as possible, and use minimal processing like EQ, filtering, stereo processing. For example, flangers and phasers can also introduce them, delay can introduce them. There's a lot of different effects that can introduce phase shifts, and therefore you should keep those to a minimum. This is also partially where we created this, for example, stereo layer before. In that case, what you will do is you will only have the phase shift on that tiny layer and not on the main bassline, like we had before when we had stereo effects on the main bassline. So that's where the stereo layer comes in handy as well. If you want to shift your phase shift from any stereo effects off the main bassline onto a separate layer, then the effect should be a little bit more subtle, hopefully. So yeah, keep that in mind to keep your bassline as clean as possible. The second thing we've already been talking about, we've been talking about using analyzers. So we've been using Psyscope for this tutorial for a little while now. So that's a waveform analyzer. There's two other analyzers that you can use. So let's look into them in the DAW as well. So I'm going to group these all together so we can see what's happening. And we talked about the spectrum analyzer as well, which we use to show the difference between saw waves and square waves. But this is actually a very useful tool to look at the frequencies that your bassline occupies. So you can find basic information like where the first harmonic is or the fundamental, what the EQ curve looks like. If you want something to change there, you can do that, for example. So if you do want to EQ your bassline, you can see what kind of changes you're making to it on the spectrum there. The final analyzer that I want to talk about is the stereo analyzer. So I'm going to open up Stereoscope here, which is a stereo analyzer. You can see, again, we talked about the stereo analyzer before when we talked about stereo effects. The way the stereo analyzer works is, I'll actually show that on the whiteboard because I think that will be easier to explain there. So here we have the whiteboard again. Let's quickly draw that analyzer. So it looks something like this, where we have a line like that, and then we have a cross going through it. And here we have plus L, minus L. This will be plus R, and this will be minus R. So the way this works, imagine two signals passing, because obviously stereo is two signals, one for the left channel and one for the right channel. What will happen is it will take any point of the left signal and it will plot it on the left line here. So for example, if we have a signal like this going up and down from -1 to 1, which we talked about before, so you would have a 0 line here. This would be time here going this direction, and then we have our amplitude, so this is -1. I hope you can all still see this. Yeah, you just about can. And this would be 1, and obviously here we have 0. It's a little bit out of scale, but you can imagine what it looks like. What will happen is it will take, for example, let's say this point, which is just under 1, so it will map it there. It will take this point here, and it will, for example, map it there. So it will take this height at any point in time and map it to the left channel or to the right channel. It will do it on this line. And then, for example, let's say at a certain point in time we have left and right in these two channels. What will happen is it will sum them together and kind of average them out. So it will take, it will kind of draw a line in between them, and then in the middle of that line it will draw another point, and that's actually going to be displayed on the analyzer. So what that means is that for a stereo signal, which is the difference, any difference, for example, a full difference here, is going to show up on this line. So here we have a negative value, and then here we have the same value positive. That's obviously going to end up on this line here, right in the middle, at where that point is. Anything which is exactly the same, so the example we had before, is going to line up at this line. So what that means is that anything on this line is mono, and anything on this line is fully stereo. And anything that sits in between, for example, something that sits right here is obviously left, so that is halfway between mono and stereo. This is more mono than stereo. This is more stereo than mono. You kind of have a gradient going on of the stereo field that you have. So this is a way that the stereo field can be displayed, and this is how your stereo analyzer should work. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the relationship between the kick and the bass. So we already said that the function of the bass is really to support the kick into getting a little bit of extra groove and getting some sub bass in the track in between the individual kicks. So that means that the kick is our main element, which again we said before, but that also means that the bass line is usually slightly less in volume than your kick. So when you're designing your bass line, keep that in mind, that you want your bass line to be at least a little bit lower in volume than your kick. The next good practice is a little bit of a hot debate. I think most producers I know process their kick and bass together, but I would actually argue that you shouldn't do that. You should really see them as two separate elements. in that your kick is really the main driving factor of your track, and the bass line is really there to support it and to sit a little bit in the background to give it a little bit of extra groove and the sub bass that we've talked about before. So therefore, I also recommend not processing them together. The way you should see them is that you should make the processing for the kick should make a little bit of space for the bass, and the processing for the bass should make a little bit of space for the kick. And then the whole gluing together of the kick and the bass should, in my mind, happen in the master channel. So for that reason, I actually don't process my kick and bass together. I actually process my kick with all my other drums and then my bass line on its own. Within that ballpark, what I do want to say is that you should phase align your kick and bass. Now what that means, let's actually go into the DAW. So let's talk about phase alignment here. You can see here with the bass line that we have now, which is just a simpler bass line that we started off with just to keep it simple. You can see we have a little bit of a peak, and that's just this bass note summing with whatever is here. So there's a few ways to fix that. One, you can go into your bass line and actually mess with the phase of your bass line. So let's try that for a start. And you can see that kind of works, but now the click is a little bit off the edge. So here, this would be the first click of your bass line. So it's a little bit off the grid. So that's not ideal. What you would rather want is to actually, in my opinion, mess with the phase of the kick. So here, one thing, because we have a little bit of extra space here, we can use some of that space for post-ringing. So we don't necessarily need a fully clean kick here. We can add some phase shift in it using filters. So that's actually what I'm going to do here. And to do that, we're actually using a very steep filter here. So I just activated it. Let's look at the difference. And by just turning it up, you can see we're shifting the tail of the kick around, and now it is phase aligned in such a way that the click here happens at the low point here. And you can see the volume never rises again above the actual volume of the kick. So the bass line is mixed in such a way now that the kick and the bass line summing together isn't going to cause an increase in volume. So that's really something that you should strive for. So that the volume of the kick is also kind of the loudest volume of the kick and the bass together. So this is how you achieve that, is to either through the phase of the bass line, which I don't really like, or with this trick here where we're using the phase shift, and because we have some extra space, we can actually use the phase shift here and just set up a very steep filter to change the phase of the bass in such a way that the attack and the clicks that sit in the waveform of the bass line fit nicely into whatever we have here in the kick, the tail of the kick. So you might notice that we talk a lot about phase, and you might be wondering if you could resample to fix that problem. And what resampling is that you take a recording of your bass line and something like this, and you record it, and then you just use this version of the bass line here. And what you can do is you can, for example, just strip away all of the parts that you think you're going to have a problem with and just use the audio clip here. Well, for one, what people tend to do then is they go back in and with the same mindset continue processing their bass line. They're just not happy with the sound yet, so they'll get back into it and actually continue working on the bass line. That's really a bad idea. Secondly, I don't like it in the sense that you lose that kind of creativity that you have when you have a normal patch. So in this case, I'm stuck with this bass line sound now, and that's not ideally what you would want. You would want to be able to go back into the bass line that you have, and in that case, you need to keep the bass line in your project, and in that case, you might as well use the actual patch if you still need to keep the patch in your project, and there's no real benefit. The final thing that I'll say is that this also gives a false sense of security. Setting up your bass line like this in resampled version, what it will do is you kind of forget about the whole issue with phase, and when you get to the mastering stage especially, people tend to forget about it and they'll still introduce those problems with the filters that they use in the mastering stage. So if you keep it as a patch, you tend to be more aware of some of the troubles that filters may cause when you're working on a bass line. But also later on in the project, if you're going into mastering and like finalizing the track, you're still going to be aware because you see, okay, this is a synth patch, and because it's a synth patch, I need to worry about the phase. So it kind of just acts as a reminder as well. Obviously, you can still decide to resample, but then those problems that I mentioned before, those are things that you need to take into consideration. The final thing that I want to talk about is not going overboard. A lot of people tend to kind of really work a lot on their bassline, thinking it's the kind of the magical element of the track. And the fact of the matter is that you can cover up a lot of the details of your bassline, the things that you don't really like with other sounds, for example, delay tails of synths, whatever effects that you have in your track, vocals, all those kind of things can sit on top of your bassline and kind of hide the little details that you're not really keen on of your actual bassline. So now I want to show you 4 advanced tricks that you can use if you're a little bit more of an advanced sound designer and you're a little bit more comfortable making bass sounds. And the first one is to actually isolate the notes that play with the kick and the notes that play without the kick, and then use different bass patches accordingly. So let's actually look at that here. And the way you would set it up is you would duplicate the bass sound here, and you take the notes that are on the kick. So this note here is playing on the kick, and we'll remove that from one, and then everything that's off the kick, we'll remove that from the other. And then what I like to do is to make sure that the sub basses of these 2 elements don't clash. Let's go into this bass line here and just completely remove the sub. And you can even go for removing some of the first harmonic or the second harmonic here as well. And now you can hear the difference. If I just solo it, you can hear it's not going to sound that great. The bass line itself now has missing a lot of weakness, or it's missing a lot of its strength. You can definitely hear that it lacking sub bass is not something that you want to do on all of these notes. But with the kick, you can hear it just sits in there nicely as the subs don't clash. So you should now be able to see, if we look at Psyscope, that the bassline actually loses a lot of volume if you remove that sub bass. You can see how the waveform kind of becomes a little bit smaller here, and the peaks just become a little bit less loud. So that's a result of removing the sub bass frequencies. You lose some of the volume of the sound, and obviously that's going to help you mix it in with the kick a lot better. The second advanced tip is kind of what we've seen before done on the kick here, with introducing a phase shift deliberately. What you might want is a little bit of a dirtier bassline in some cases. They tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and they just have a little bit of a different tone. What I've done is I've made a rack here, which I'll quickly go over, and that is bass all pass rack here. Just a very simple idea. And the way this works is we have 2 effect chains, and the main effect is coming from these filters here. So these are very steep filters, so they're going to introduce a lot of phase shift at a certain frequency, which is controlled by this macro. You can see both of these are being controlled by the same macro here. And then on one of them, there is this serum effect, which is doing an all pass filter. And that all pass filter is also controlled here with this tone. And that just adds a little bit of extra character to it in the higher frequency. So you can set a frequency. I'll usually set it around like 260, something like that, 250 maybe. And you can see now the shape of the bassline completely changes. So we can dial in any shape that we want for a bassline. And this is just a different way you can experiment with changing the shape of your bassline. You can see some combinations might work. If we, for example, set it higher, it might sound a bit different, a bit better. But lower, it's probably going to sound a bit worse here, because it's going to remove the sub actually. So we can just play with that, and this is another way to kind of change up the waveform and just changes the tone. This is very controlled, obviously, because I've experimented with this for a long time now. I kind of know what I'm doing, and I'm just kind of showing you how it's evolving if you change it like that. But when you're using this trick, you do need to set very specific frequency values and very specific tone values. And the way you train that is by just setting it by ear. So I'm going to leave this bass rack in the description as a download so you can play with it. But I do recommend that you get handy with it first, learn how it sounds on different bass sounds before you actually put it in the production. So now say that you want to do some tonal EQing here. One thing that you can do to make your workflow a little bit faster, again, this is a little bit of an advanced tip, is instead to use multi-band dynamics. Now you don't even have to actually set up any compression on these. So I'm going to go to default here, which is going to remove all compression. But what you can do is use the different multi-bands to change the tone. So for example, we can isolate some frequencies here. For example, let's say we'll isolate these frequencies here and just turn them down a little bit. And for this one, I'll set it to linear phase. You can obviously work with as many bands as you want, but in this case, what this is really useful for is that you're not really inclined to create more bands just out of nothing, because the multi-band way of working really puts your mind into where do I set bands and how many bands do I need right from the get-go, and that limits your your workflow, and therefore you tend to work a little bit faster. So it's a little bit hard to explain, and it's probably a concept that you guys know, that if you ever whip up an EQ, that it tends to be that you spend a lot of time on that EQ. And so this, because it's like an easier workflow, you just have like 3 volume buttons here that you can work with, and then you have the multi-band frequencies that you have to set. You have to basically set just 5 parameters by ear, and then that's a lot faster than having like the endless option that the plugin like FabFilter might give you, where you can really isolate every single harmonic, every single resonance in your bassline, and you just spend a lot of time working on very small details, which, as I explained before, might not always be what you want. The last idea we already talked about, and that is layering up different basslines to create a more complex bassline. I do now want to show you some examples of that in action, so let's actually dive into some of my projects where I've done that sort of thing, and let's actually look at 2 of the basslines that I've made which use this technique. So here's the first kick and bass that I want to talk about. This is a layered bassline in that there is an extra layer coming in some parts of the track. So let's actually listen to how this layering system sounds like, how this setup sounds like. This is a little bit more of an easier one than the other examples, so let's first dive into this one. So here you can hear adding extra rhythm by introducing this kind of plucky layer on top of it. So that's a cool way to add variations between parts of your song, where you want some more rhythm, some more groove in there. You can see we're also following that with like overall the drums as well. So that's the first example. Now let's look at the second example, which is a little bit more complex. So here's the second example. This bass line sounds like this. So this is a lot more layers here. We have like a main layer here. We have a tonal layer here, which together sounds like this. Then we have these 2 layers here, which add just a little bit of rhythm. And finally, we have this extra layer on top of there as well to add some more rhythm as well. So that all together sounds like this. So as you can see, another kind of complex rhythmic idea by layering multiple bass sounds on top of each other and using that as a bass line. So now we're actually going to make some bass lines, and the first bass line that we're going to make is a very simple 16 note bass line, and I'm going to show you my whole workflow for that So I'm going to do this on speakers, so I won't be using headphones because then it's a lot easier for me. That means that when I'm playing the sound, I will not be talking, and therefore I need to do some things in the edit to make sure that there's no bleeding and stuff. But let's get into that. The first thing I'm going to do is create the MIDI track for it, and I'm going to add the instrument for it, which is going to be Serum, which for me is here. And then we're directly going to select this. So this is going to be our bass. We'll call it bass main. And let's actually already group it and then call this. It's always good to stay organized. In this case, we can directly select bass group. So any layers will also show up in the size scope analyzer, which I'm going to open up now just to have it below here. I'll usually have this on a separate window, but for now let's actually go ahead and play with this some. So I'm going to start off by creating a real quick and dirty filter envelope that we can use. So I'm just going to go and run between different filters and listen to that. I'm also going to set up the volume envelope first, so we have an idea of what the volume sounds like, and then we'll set it up like this, obviously, and then set the velocity as well. So this is going to be an aux input. So this velocity is going to determine the amount of modulation that this volume is going to get from LFO2. So now we can quickly insert our MIDI for this bass line here. So I'm going to place 4 notes here. I'm going to make this bass line in A sharp for now, because that's where I'm most comfortable. I'm going to set it in the bass register. So in Ableton, that would be the 0 register. And now we're going to go back into the patch. And we're going to listen to it, how it sounds now. So we have an issue here already, and that is our envelopes are not set correctly. So obviously we want it to sound like this. But there's another problem. Obviously the phase needs to be turned down like that. And you can see we have a little bit of an issue where the volume is just not set up correctly. So let's actually set the volume all the way up. So we have at 0 dB here. And we can see this is just a mess. So that's the first thing that we need to address. And I'm going to do that by the trick that we've shown before, by first separating the bass line. And then to remove some of the low end. Now this temporary setup, I'm just using the basic saw wave. What you can do is modify that saw wave. There's a lot of things that you can do by that. But for now, we'll just use the very simple saw wave that everybody has, the initialized saw wave. One thing I am going to do though is I'm quickly going to take, undo that. Take this bass here, and I'm just going to play with the phase of the bass line. So for example, here you can see we can make it louder already. And now we should have a bass line that's just a little bit louder. I can turn this down here as well. I can still work on that maybe. Let's work on this version again a little bit. Need to turn my volume up. I like the kind of sound from that second harmonic, the higher harmonic sound that you have. I can show what that is. That would be. Oh. This sound here. So obviously together with that kind of sound. I do really like having the higher harmonic that you hear with the filter this open. So I'm not happy with the click. So in order to fix that, this is going to be bass main on beat, and this is going to be main bass Offbeat, again, keeping with the theme of keeping everything organized. This is going to be the click of our bass. And let's just add the MIDI from both of these here. So we have something to trigger it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to employ another trick, which I really like, and that's to use this icon has click here. So if we look at the way this the way this looks, you can almost see it as a saw series in terms of the harmonics. With disregarding the lower part, it does go up like the saw wave harmonics does, and it does something weird with the phase, which results in something like this. So I haven't set a specific like wave table position here. I kind of just do it by ear. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use that for a click. So the first thing we want is we kind of want just the start of this wave. So to achieve that, you can just roll off this here. And by rolling it off a little bit further, you can see the energy kind of sits at the start of the wave, which is kind of what we want together with this phase setup. So we can have a very short click here and set this to 16 notes, of course, and set it up. Let's set it up all the way. And we can use velocity once again to set the overall volume here. And now we just have a click. And this click is a little bit more interesting than your average click that we showed off before, where when I showed off click layers, in the sense that it's just, you can see there's a little bit more going on. If we really zoom in on it, you can see what is happening, and it's that it has this little bit of a pitch envelope, which is just a little bit of an extra cool sounding sound to me. And altogether, it actually sounds like this. Now you can see obviously our click layer is way too loud, so we're going to turn it down a lot. And we're also going to EQ it in a way that it doesn't really clash. Now for us to do that, the way we're going to do that is we're going to open up the spectrum here, and we're going to look for any comb filtering. Now you can pretty much see that there's this comb filtering happening here at this area, where you can see those little like hills almost. And that means that there's things that are slightly out of phase. So there's a slight phase offset, which are causing these dips. So to fix that, we're just going to assign this as a little bit more of a low and low mid-range area. So something like this should do, maybe even a little bit higher. And then our click is just going to be very high frequencies here. Now I'm not really worried about the phase shift at this point here, because the oscillation is so short that the post ringing is going to be really, really short. So you don't have to worry about, for example, with the sub bass, because this oscillation, for example, for this sub bass is so long, the post ringing is going to be very long as well. But for these short frequencies, it doesn't really matter that much. So I'm perfectly comfortable filtering it out like this with a normal EQ that introduces a lot of post ringing. It should already look a little bit cleaner. We have a little dip there, so that's okay. We can put this down a little bit, and that should fix that. Maybe that's too much. That's good enough for me. We can add a little bit of volume back into the click. We're going to do some final post-processing there as well. But it's starting to sound nice to me. The final thing that I do want is a little bit of grit to it and a little bit of stereo wave. So I'm going to combine those two into one. And I'm actually going to copy over the bass here, because I like to work from the same starting point when making stereo layers. So I'm going to copy over the MIDI as well. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to generate some stereo, but in this case, I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different way. I'm going to still use M stereo spread, but I'm going to very slightly add some stereo to it. And then I'm going to also use the stereo generator here before the stereo processor. That's also going to introduce a slight bit of stereo. So this way we're kind of spreading the load. And what that allows us to do is that it allows us to kind of mix the artifacts. So these stereo spreaders, these stereo generator plugins introduce a lot of artifacts in the signal. And in order to not have a lot of artifacts from one plugin, we'll use multiple plugins to kind of all do a little bit. And that way we're avoiding kind of the major artifacts of all of those plugins by using them just slightly. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the EQ trick that I've shown before to filter out all of the mono information. Let's look at the stereo here. And we're just going to clean up the stereo here as well. And together with the rest of our bass line, it sounds like this. I'm happy with that. Let's hear it with the kick. I do believe we have to set this velocity a little bit more here for this click. Now let's do some post-processing on this whole bass here. So I'm going to do a little bit of tonal post-processing, and the way I'd like to do it, because I know that this works for me, is to start out from this preset and just set it to linear phase. So let's look at SiScope and see what it's doing. First of all, we obviously have to compensate for the timing, which we've done now. And one thing that I noticed is that our kick already sits on the grid, right? So if we zoom in here now, because we have set it up with this filter, which we did before, we don't have to align it again. So if you were to do that, obviously, this is what the bass looks like if you don't, and if you align it, it just falls nicely into place and it just looks and sounds a lot better to me. So a bit of the post-processing here. Obviously we start with multi-band dynamics for the tone. I like to set it up that the lowest band is always just the sub. And then here, yeah, we can just play with the tone of it a little bit. And the compressor is not really doing anything except for these lower bands. So I'm actually going to slightly turn down on the ratio here, and I'm just going to diminish this compression a little bit. So that's just going to boost the volume of it a little bit. Now let's look at our volume overall here. We're getting close to 0. So let's actually drive it just a little bit into a limiter. Now I don't want to do this too much, because as I explained before, if you drive it too much into the limiter, you're going to undo the velocity that you've set up, because it's going to bring the volumes closer together. There are some other things that I want to do. I do want to do some stereo processing here. Obviously make sure that our sub bass is mono. So we'll look at where we've set the sub bass frequency here. So that's 87. What I like to do is set the frequency just in between the fundamental and the first harmonic. So here, what I've done is, if we look at it, it's in the middle of the dip. And the reason for that is the filter artifacts are most notable at the filter crossover. So exactly at this point. So if we put it right in the middle, you're not going to catch any artifacts on either of the two harmonics, or the artifacts are going to be very minimal. The closer this is to one of those harmonics, the more that harmonic is affected by that filter. So we set it in the middle just to make sure that it's the least affected. So going back into here, we'll set this to linear phase just because I know it works for this particular example. And we'll set up something sensible like this. I'm going to slightly excite the high end here. And I'm going to bring these a little bit down so that it glues it a little bit better. So that sounds nice to me. I really like that the transient is a little bit more stereo as well. So yeah, that's the first bass line that I wanted to show. So with all this knowledge in mind, we can easily make an offbeat bass by just taking this. We don't even need this one, but taking the click, and we can delete that from the click. And then here, what we want is we want this to be a longer note. And the same occurs for this. We don't have to do that for the click because the click is only going to play right here. And then what we do need to do is in the patch, go and set this to 8 notes here. And the same is true for our stereo layer. We'll set it to 8 and 8 as well. So now you have a nice offbeat kind of bass line. So let's look at our third bass line that we can make, and I'm going to do this from scratch again. So I'm going to drop a MIDI in here, and we'll remove this here, and this is going to be the slide bass. So now let's look at how you make a slide bass from scratch. So we'll put this on here, and then obviously I want to make it white just to be organized. We'll draw in one note. Let's do a little bit of a lower note here. Let's go for like F. And obviously we set it to F0. And now we set up our filter. I'm going to go with a 24 decibels per octave for this one, just to get a different tone, just for some experimentation. And I'm going to set up a kind of weird looking shape for now. But this is going to be 1/4 note, obviously, because the bar is the whole bar long. And then for this, we're going to set up a sidechain, which is going to be a little bit more of an aggressive shape here to really get out of the way of the kick. And that's already sounding nice, but there's a lot more that we can do. So I'm actually going to add some I-Can-Has kick in here as an extra tonal layer. So I really want to remove the lower frequencies in order to do that. And then we set up a sidechain like this. I think I do like it like that. What I do want is I want everything to be synced up. So I'm going to set it like this, and then we'll find a nice phase for it. I do like how it sounds like that. I'm going to turn it down slightly in volume, so this oscillator is a little bit more dominant. And here again, I want to mess with the phase to get a little bit more of a cleaner waveform. So let's look at what we have. This should be a nice looking wave. Okay, so now that we have everything synced up, we can already see from the waveform that it looks really clean, in the sense that it just kind of continues to oscillate into the bassline. I do really want to change kind of the volume of this part here. So it's a little bit boring there now. So let's work on that. Instead, we'll have it drop down a little bit, and we'll set up the volume so that's a little bit louder. That's too loud, so You might want to choose for this being a little bit more of a shape like this. And we can also maybe be a little bit less aggressive on the filter cutoff. Obviously, there's a lot of things that you can do. I want to add an extra stereo layer, at least for this. So let's add some stereo. And just like last time, I want to work off the original for the stereo layer. That's usually how I work. In this case, I'm just going to use the stereo spread on this. And again, we'll filter out the lower parts here. But I'm going to do that with an EQ, which is linear phase, because we're staying close to the bass frequencies now here. We are just going to like EQ it off like this. And then for our mid-range, to get rid of our mid-range, we set it to mid-side, or to get rid of our mid-signal, we set it to mid-side, and now we have stereo. Obviously, I want to volume compensate this. And then I want to mix it in with the mixer itself. I can feel like I can pretty easily get it into a high volume and have it sound nice. The final thing I want to do is add a grid layer. So we'll do it like this, and we'll take the original. Now for this grid layer, I'm going to go so high that I'm willing to use normal EQs here. I'm actually going to tune this to the key of F. So we're kind of giving the key of the sound a boost. And this one we do want to lower it like this. Now let's group these together. Let's actually, we're still using this post-processing here. So what we want to do in this case is again set up our post-processing. Let's actually do it from scratch so it's easier for you guys to see. I'm actually going to do something with an EQ here because what I want to do later is to show you how you can do pitch slides on this. So in this case, when you're going to do pitch slides with this kind of bass line here, if you want to attenuate a specific frequency, you can only do it through the EQ and no longer through like editing the harmonics. Whereas if you're staying on the same pitch, you can just edit the harmonics, so you don't have to actually use an EQ in that case. But for this case, I'm going to boost 100 Hertz. And this is a track that I often like on my bass lines, because that's kind of where the punch is in the bass line, and it's just that kind of that second harmonic which really brings in the punch. Now what I do like is to kind of pull as well. So what we're doing is we're pushing 100 Hertz here, and now I'm going to pull down a frequency that's higher above that. And this kind of push-pull trick is something that I learned when I went to that professional studio. This is one of the tricks that he showed me to do, and it's been working phenomenally for me, and it works well on this bass line as well here. Just gives it a little bit of a darker sound, which I really like, together with, again, tonal control that we're going to do here. I'm going to go to default. We'll just use 3 bands in this case. And it's pretty clear where it should be here. We have this really, really high end, which we don't really need, so I'm just going to turn it down a little bit. And I want to get the grid out a little bit as well. So this is just my tonal control. and we'll just push it ever so slightly into this limiter here. Now let's look at our size scope, see if we're still doing well. As you can see, in terms of the volume, we have something that is very close to the kick, so that's really going to complement it well, and that's how I would do a slide bass. Now moving on from that, the way you want to add some melody to that is by just extending this bass note, something like this. And we talked about this before, how you would want to set up mono, legato, and some kind of glide here. So I'm going to go with 100, and these settings should be equal for all three of them, so they still sound coherent. So this should be 100, and then finally 100 here as well. And now we can start to play with the volume a little bit, or with the notes, sorry. It's getting late for me, so let's add a little third slide here, and then we'll add a seventh like this. In this case, what we do need is to set this to trigger mode, which is something I forgot, so I'll do that for all of them. Okay, so instead of trigger mode, you want to just turn off this envelope mode. And let's make another tone here, something like this. And then we'll continue here like this. I want this slide to happen a little later. Let's actually turn that around. Go like this. And finally like this. So that sounds like a fun little swinging melody to me, which we can use for this bass line. So now it sounds like this. Maybe going up so much, it's a little bit too much for the stereo layer, so I'm going to turn that down a bit. What we also can do is play with the volume. So I'm just going to set up an envelope like this. Maybe even like this. Just some variations here. So that's a cool little stereo sliding bass line kind of idea. The final example that I want to give is some complex layered bass line. So actually going to continue from this point here. I'm going to create a new patch using, again, Serum. This is going to be our plug layer. And we'll just make some melody that I know works well here. So I'm going to copy over the fact that this is 3 higher and then this is 5 higher like this. So we'll probably do it like that. And then here again, the octave swing. And then here we should do something like that. Now obviously we want to be in number 1. And we're going to set this to envelope 16. Envelope 16. This is going to be our volume, which is just going to go down like this. And then we'll set our velocity we'll set our phase to be right here. I'm actually going to use a custom saw wave for this. So there's different saw waves that you can use. It doesn't really matter too much, but how's it going? Yeah, so there's different saw waves in here that I have. So this diet one might be cool here because it has a little bit less low end, I think, and we're actually going to remove the low end entirely from that. And finally set up the filter cutoff here. Something like this. I like it to be one directional, the filter cutoff. So, and we'll keep it for 12 dB per octave for now. Let's listen to that. I'm actually adding a layer to this. Now this might seem a little bit weird that I'm using some detune here, but if you use it in a very controlled manner for like only the high end, it does sound really nice. And obviously again here we're going to use velocity, and let's actually set up some velocity curve here. So I'm going to set all the offbeat ones a little bit higher velocity, and then this is going to be very low here. So now we have something like this. Now that's not very exciting yet because it's all in the center. I'm actually going to add this to the stereo field as well. So because it's no low end, there's no harm in just throwing on a widening plugin like this. And again, some EQing will mainly EQ out the high end. Let's add some grit to it. Let's actually use the saturator to make sure that it clips at 0 here at the output. So this is just soft clipping it. And that should sound nice. So now we have something that sounds like this. And I'm going to layer this in with another sound here. This will be the final sound for this bass line here, which is going to be in the same octave as this pluck. And we're going to have it just there and there. And this is going to be very similar to that reverb thing that you heard in the other one, in one of the examples that I had. So let's play this, see if we can. So obviously it's going to go an octave higher. And what we're going to do is just make a simple plug. In this case, I'm not going to use the LFO because it takes a little bit more time to set up. But we're going to use a down sample as well. And now we just have something like that. We can actually remove the lower harmonics in here directly. Let's add some saturation though. And we should set phase to be always the same. Then I'm going to add a reverb one that I like. Yeah, let's keep the pre-delay. That does sound pretty nice. I'm going to make it a bit longer. And finally we'll add some multiband into it. And I did hear some rumbling in the sub bass, so we're going to EQ that out. Let's set it for -10 now. That should be a good volume for this kind of thing. I'll add a sidechain to this and I'll just quite uncertain. I might want to pitch this down 1 octave. And that's a nice little sliding effect to it, I think. I'm still uncertain if I want the pre-delay, maybe not. So I do like the kind of ambience that this reverb gives. One thing to remember is that you don't really want the reverb in the low end, so that's why we're really like getting rid of the low end here. But this is going to be our reverb layer. And with that, this bassline should be finished. So those are all of the examples that I wanted to give. I will now want to challenge you to also make 5 basslines, 1 in each category, and to send them to my Discord. This is going to be like an exercise for you that you can do. And there will be like discussion time happening on the Discord. So there's an exercises channel in the Discord linked in the description. And you can go there and submit your work and then discuss work that you've done with others if you're into that kind of thing. This is just like an extra free exercise little thingy that you can do. So I hope everybody does consider doing them, because I do really want to get like a community going around these exercises as well. I think it's a really cool way to improve your music production skill by doing these kind of exercises. I've done other exercises in the past as well. So the last one that I did was 2 videos ago now. If you haven't looked at that video, I highly recommend that you watch that one as well. But now let's close off with some final thoughts that I have on bassline design and some of the workflow things that you can do to improve like your basses. So the first thing that I want to say, as you can see, I have not been doing this whole bassline designing thing in a track. I've actually been doing this in a separate session. I highly recommend that you do it that way. That way, anytime you're experimenting, you're doing it in the time of a session and not in the time of an actual production. I would recommend that if you're working on an actual production that you're planning on releasing, that you keep it simple, stick to the things that you know that work, so that you don't spend a whole lot of time working on bassline while the song really needs some more elements before you can really judge what the bassline is doing. So that's a very good tip that I think you should keep in mind, that experimentation is really something that stands alone away from actual music and actual like music writing when it comes to Psytrance. Obviously what you can do is have a experimentation session and then take whatever you made during that session and turn it into a track. But in that case, I would recommend you start a new project and then just import anything that you need from the other project into the new project, so you can build around it there. Yeah, this mindset is really to make sure that when you're in the production mind, that you focus on what is important, which is the whole picture, the whole track, and not just very small details on a particular sound that most of the time are going to be covered by other sounds. In my opinion, the best way of working in that case is just to spend a little bit more time working on the whole song and a little bit of less time on working on the details. So that's why I'm giving that tip. The final thing that also falls in the vein of speeding up your workflow is the other thing that you could do, and that is to use a sample. Personally, I would say that there's no shame in using a sample. I personally don't do it because in production, productions of mine, I do really want to have some control of how the bass line sounds and what it is doing. But if you're not at that level yet, that you can easily whip up a bass sound that you like, and there are samples that you do like, then there's no shame into using samples. Also for progressive psytrance, if you're like want a sound, or if you want to make a song that is a few different bass sounds together, kind of a little bit more of a complex drop, then you don't have to make all of the sounds. You could, for example, make the main sound and then decide to add some other sounds that you use from samples. There's, again, no shame in that. At the end of the day, we're here to make good music, not good bass lines. And if a sample is going to help you make good music, then you should be able to use it. And there shouldn't be no shame in that. So that's it. It's been almost 3 hours of recording for me, so I'm really tired, and I hope you wouldn't be able to notice throughout this video that I was tired, but it was a little bit of a late recording session as well, so the video might not come out as I want it to be fully. I am very much somebody who looks at the details when I'm pushing videos, especially videos like these, which I find really important. But yeah, this is going to be the video for today. What might happen, as I said again, is that for the next 1 week or 2 weeks, or maybe even more, depending a little bit on my timing, I won't upload a video because we have family over. So this was the last video that I could make. If it goes up in time, if it doesn't go up in time even this video, then you know why that happens. But yeah, this is going to be the video. If you want to support this channel, support the work that I do here, and you want to do it in the best way possible, for me right now, the best way you can support me is to listen to my music on Spotify and Apple Music. And the links for that are going to be in the description as well in the comments. I've been posting links to my SoundCloud, my Spotify and my Apple Music in all of the comments of all of my videos. So hopefully I can push it a little bit more. So if you want to help with that, please go listen to my music, add some of my music to a playlist that you often listen to, and then support me through that. Other than that, I do want to quickly push my Discord again, because there's the exercises. That's my whole community, my whole place. So if you haven't joined my Discord already, I highly recommend you join that for music discussion and those kind of things. And yeah, that's going to be the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. That really helps the channel a lot. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe to it as well. There's going to be more content like this in the future. So definitely subscribe for more. That's going to be it for today, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.